Hello and welcome to Cash Reviews. In today's video, we're taking a look at a cheap cast eBay turbo manifold here that is specific to a 1.6 liter Miata. Now, I've been running this manifold on my car for about 3 seasons, and I've put this thing through a lot of testing and abuse. In this video, I'm going to go over whether I think this part was worth it and how it held up, as well as the big problem that I had with one of these manifolds. To begin, let's talk about the specs and features of this manifold, and then later we'll get into price and performance. So this manifold, again, is specific to a 1.6 liter Miata. This is a cast manifold, which means this is made from one piece of metal that's all melted down, and it's not a tubular manifold. And this is very important, but I'll get into that later during the performance section of this video. The flange on this manifold is a T3 flange, which means you could only bolt turbos up that also have the same bolt pattern and size on them. I'll get into this later as well. But first, let's talk price and what you actually get for that price. So the price on these turbo manifolds is very inexpensive, which is why I initially went with this. These manifolds only cost a little over $100 shipped, and I thought that was a pretty good value, but again, I'll get into the problems and my thoughts on that later. Now, when you order one of these things off of eBay, it comes with the manifold itself, so you'll have that to bolt right up to your head. It will come with a gasket that you could use between the manifold and the head. And finally, it comes with a gasket, some studs, and some mounting hardware to get your turbo on here. Now that you know a little bit about the manifold itself and what you get, let's talk about installation and how this part met my expectations. Installation was actually quite simple and straightforward on this manifold. Everything went exactly as planned. So this means all of these holes lined up perfectly with the studs on the head of the engine, and this went right on with really no problems. One thing that I will note during installation though is I didn't use this gasket that came with the kit. I had a different higher quality one that I opted to use, and I did use this gasket between the manifold and the turbo, but I had some problems with that, which I'll get into shortly. Also, the studs and hardware that were included, I also didn't use because I went with a higher end stud kit, just because I didn't want them backing out or stretching and having problems with my turbo. But again, more on that later. So now that you know that, let's talk about the application of this manifold to help you determine if this is for you. So this manifold is basically the bottom line price point manifold that you could use to turbocharge your Miata. I turbocharged my whole car for right around $1,200, and I have a whole build series on that if you're interested, but this manifold was one of the major parts that allowed me to do that because of the very inexpensive price point. If you're looking for a cast manifold, which I would highly recommend if you're looking on the lower end of manifolds, this is pretty much the option that you have for a 1.6 liter Miata. The reason that you would want to go with a cast manifold over a welded tubular manifold when you're looking at cheap stuff is a tubular manifold is comprised of a bunch of pieces of metal that are welded together, often not with very good welds, and they're much more likely to crack than a one-piece manifold like this. But again, more on that later because I did have a problem with one of these. In terms of testing and how this thing actually held up for me, it was actually pretty decent. I ran one of these manifolds on my car for 3 whole seasons on the street and on countless track days, and I only had a problem at my last track day, so 3 seasons is pretty good without problems. Now, in terms of spool and performance, before I get into those problems, this manifold is okay. It's definitely not great, and if you look at the shape of the manifold, the collectors are not equal length to where the turbo is, and there are also a lot of sharp angles that exhaust has to travel through to get to the turbo. Because of that, there are definitely other manifolds that would be better in terms of flow and performance, but they're not this cheap, and this one definitely works fine. My car's around 200 wheel horsepower, and this manifold was perfectly fine for that application. One thing that I did notice is since this is a T3 flange turbo, there are not a lot of cheaper turbos that are small enough to really spool on an engine that's just a 1.6 liter like this is made for. Ideally, this would have been a T2 flange, which opens up to more cheap options. That said, if you're going to spend a little bit more on a turbo, you definitely could get something that spools up pretty quickly that is still a T3 flange, but it's not going to come cheap. And with that price point sometimes comes quality issues. So let's get into those and the problems that I've had. The first problem that I had is I ran this gasket between the turbo and the manifold, and this gasket did not really hold up. I actually ended up melting part of the gasket, and I did have some problems with that. So I ended up not running a gasket at all and mating the turbo straight to the manifold with some gasket maker in there, and that's been perfectly fine. It hasn't leaked. I would highly recommend doing that. I'll have that gasket maker linked down below. Now, in terms of the manifold itself, again, this manifold is actually very decent quality for the price. It's a cast manifold, so it's all one piece, so it has a lower chance of breaking than a tubular manifold. That said, though, I did still have my manifold crack on me while I was at a track day pushing my car, and it was just a minor crack. It wasn't anything major, but that's actually the reason why I have this new one sitting here in front of me. That said, I put a lot of time abusing this manifold on my car, and for $100, I'm really not too mad about it. The other thing that you also want to consider is some people recommend slicing between each individual collector on the flange there to allow your manifold to expand and contract more easily than when it's just this one big cast piece. I'm going to try this on this manifold, and hopefully that will help extend the life of this, but even if I get another 3 years or so out of this manifold for $100, I'm pretty happy with that. So final thoughts on this manifold are, if you're looking for a cheap way to turbo your car, again, I turbocharged mine for $1,200 total, and I have a full build series on this. This manifold is probably your best bet. If you're looking for maximum performance, be it spool up and flow, and a part that's never going to break on you, this part may not be for you. However, I think there are a lot of applications that this is the go-to option, and I'm pretty happy that I went with this given my goals for my turbo project, which was cheap and fairly reliable power. 3 years out of one of these things is pretty good, so I'm okay with that. I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. Again, if you want to see my complete turbo build, go ahead and click on the end screen. I thank you for watching, and I hope you stick around for the next one. Take care.